Hi, I'm Teresa. A year ago, I sat at my own dinner table while my mother-in-law poured hot oil on me for saying no, not screaming, not fighting, just no. But the burn wasn't the worst part. It was how my husband watched and said, she didn't mean it. Now, every year on that same day, I stand in front of a crowd and read the email he once sent. She's not valuable anymore. And I wonder, how many women are quietly erased, not by strangers, but by the ones who said they loved them? What would have happened if I'd stayed quiet? The smell of brewed coffee lingered in the air, mixing with the lemon-scented cleaner I'd used earlier that morning. The windows in the kitchen were cracked just enough to let in the faint scent of dew and the distant hum of a neighbor's lawnmower. This was my version of peace. A Sunday morning, sunlight warming the tile floors. The house quiet, except for the rhythmic ticking of the clock above the stove. I stood by the kitchen island, tracing the edge of a ceramic bowl I'd bought from a local artisan fair years ago. It wasn't expensive, but it was mine, like most things in this house. I'd picked the paint colors, chosen the light fixtures, even laid the mosaic backsplash behind the sink myself. This wasn't just where I lived. It was where I built a life, and I didn't build it for visitors to rearrange. In my family, boundaries were sacred. In his, boundaries were just suggestions, especially if Velda didn't agree. The front door opened without a knock. I didn't need to look up. The scent of overly sweet perfume and lemon bars hit me before her voice did. Well, isn't this place just shining? Velda's tone had that syrupy quality she saved for when she wanted to appear polite, but dig in the knife. I thought I'd stop by. Brought some of my famous bars. You know Silas can't resist them. I wiped my hands and smiled. The kind you give to someone when you're trying to pretend the air isn't shifting around you. Thanks, Velda. You didn't have to. Oh, I know. But I wanted to. She walked in like she belonged, glancing at the art on the walls, straightening a pillow that didn't need straightening, touching things that weren't hers. Every move was subtle, but the message was clear. She was surveying what might someday be hers, or what she thought should have been. Silas came downstairs a few minutes later, his smile a touch too tight. He greeted his mother with a kiss on the cheek, then looked at me like he was bracing for something. That should have been my cue. We sat down with tea. Velda's eyes swept across the room like she was performing an evaluation. Teresa, dear, she said between sips, Silas and I were talking, and we thought, it might be smart for the long run if we updated the deed. You know, share it with family. It's just paperwork. I froze. My fingers gripped the edge of my cup. You mean, put your name on the house? She smiled. Well, I raised him. I should be part of the legacy too. Silas shifted in his seat, staring at the window like the right words might appear in the yard. I kept my tone even, because that's what I'd learned to do around her. That's a big decision, not something we've ever talked about. Velda's hand waved the thought away. Families that last, share. That's how we keep things in the family. Besides, it's not like you're planning to leave, right? She laughed like it was a joke, but it wasn't. Later that night, while folding laundry in the bedroom, I brought it up again. Why would you even consider adding her to the deed? Silas didn't look up from his phone. She's just looking out for us. Don't blow this out of proportion. That's not what this is about, I replied. It's about boundaries. And she's overstepping again. He sighed. Like I was being unreasonable. You know how she is. It's easier to just go along with it. I wanted to scream. Instead, I folded another towel. Easy for who? He didn't answer. And that silence, thicker than any argument, settled between us like fog. That night, I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, replaying every word, every glance, every carefully delivered jab wrapped in a smile. I thought about the way Velda had touched the frame around our wedding photo, as if she were measuring how easily it could be replaced. It wasn't just an idea she was floating. It was a test. She wanted to see how far she could go before I'd push back. How much of this house, of my life, she could claim. I turned on my side, eyes wide open in the dark. That's when it hit me. No wasn't just a word in this family. It was an act of rebellion. I said no. And that was the last peaceful word I'd speak in that house. I didn't say anything the next morning. Just went about my chores, as if the night before hadn't curled itself around my chest like a knot I couldn't untangle. The laundry, the dishes, even scrubbing out the bottom of the fridge, it was all mechanical. But it kept my hands busy while my mind kept replaying everything Velda had said, everything Silas hadn't. Late afternoon, I was folding towels when I glanced at the calendar hanging by the back door. Velda's birthday was circled in red ink. I hadn't written it. Silas must have. I rubbed my finger over the circle, then called out, casual as I could manage, "Hey, what time are we heading to your mom's?" He paused longer than he should have. "I thought you knew. It's just going to be a small family thing. Mom didn't want to make it too big." There was a beat of silence that I didn't rush to fill. "You're not going?" I asked, still not looking at him. He stepped into the room slowly, like someone approaching a dog they weren't sure would bite. "She just thought it might be simpler this way. You know how crowded those gatherings get. She didn't want to make you uncomfortable." I nodded, folded the last towel, and placed it on the stack. "Sure, simpler," I said without emotion. But my chest? It burned. Not because I was surprised, but because I wasn't. Because this didn't feel like an oversight. It felt like the beginning of a campaign. I grabbed the keys from the counter and told him I'd be back in a bit. On the drive, I passed the florist we used for our wedding and made a sharp turn into the lot. I picked out a simple bouquet, nothing fancy, and drove straight to Velda's house. She opened the door wearing pearls and the kind of pastel sweater only women like her can pull off without irony. "Oh, Teresa, what a surprise!" "I thought I'd drop off a birthday gift," I said, handing her the flowers. "Didn't want to interrupt the big celebration." She tilted her head with that same patronizing tilt I'd seen a dozen times. "Didn't Silas tell you? I didn't want you to feel out of place. You never seem to enjoy these gatherings." My smile was thin. "That's funny. I've never once said that. But you're right. It is uncomfortable now." "Let's not make this dramatic, sweetheart," she said, already turning to place the flowers in a vase. Back home, the silence stretched. Silas asked if I was okay. I told him I was just tired. But really, I was cataloging. Not just memories, but patterns. A few days later, a package arrived addressed to Silas from one of those photo print services. I left it on the counter, but curiosity got the better of me after he went out for a run. I opened the box and pulled out a thick, glossy photo album. "The Granger Family, 5 Wonderful Years," it read. I sat on the couch and flipped through it. In picture after picture, I wasn't there. Vacations I went on, dinners I hosted, anniversaries I celebrated, all memorialized without me. And where I should have been? The image was either zoomed in to crop me out, or, worse, replaced. There was one shot in particular, our 5th anniversary. We had dinner at Velda's house. I remembered posing for the photo with Silas and the rest of the family, wearing a pale blue dress. In the album, they were all there. The cake, the candles, the wine glasses, my chair. Empty. I stared at it for a long time. When Silas came home, I asked him about the album. "It's just a keepsake," he said, barely glancing at it. "Mom probably just picked her favorites." I nodded. "Yeah, looks like I wasn't one of them." He didn't answer. I closed the book gently and set it aside. You don't stop belonging in a single moment. It happens in edits, in omissions, in the unchecked shrug of a husband who stopped defending you long before he realized. And my silence? It wasn't quiet anymore. It was becoming something sharper. They thought they were freezing me out. What they didn't know, I was just starting to thaw. The invitation arrived in the mail a few days later. Cream cardstock, gold embossed lettering, the whole production. Granger Women's Legacy Banquet, it read. At the bottom, it said, honoring the women who shaped our family's future. Velda's name was listed as the keynote host. I stared at it for a while, fingers grazing the edge. When I mentioned it to Silas over dinner, he smiled like he had something to be proud of. "She wants you to give a short speech," he said. "It's part of the program. Younger voices reflecting on family values." I blinked. "She asked me to speak?" He nodded. "She said it might be time to reset things." Reset. As if I were a faulty appliance that just needed rebooting. Still, I said yes. Not for her. For me. I had something to say, and if she was giving me a microphone, I wasn't going to waste it. For the next few days, I drafted my speech between work calls and client meetings. Nothing radical, just reflections on how a family is more than blood. It's trust, respect, the space we give one another to grow. Words I knew Velda would pretend to agree with, while twisting their meaning. The night of the banquet, the community hall was lit up like a wedding reception. Strings of soft white bulbs crisscrossed the ceiling. Long tables were draped in linen, centerpieces blooming with lilies and baby's breath. People greeted each other with tight hugs and tighter smiles. I kept to the edges, holding my note cards like a shield. Backstage, I paced slowly. Silas came up behind me, gently touching my arm. "Just be yourself," he whispered. I offered a faint smile, but inside, something was gnawing. The MC walked on stage. "Ladies and gentlemen, tonight we're honored to hear from the next generation of Granger women. Please welcome Grace Rowan." I froze. Grace? She strutted to the stage in heels too high and confidence too loud. My name, my words, vanished into the air like they'd never been planned. I stood there, not breathing, while she read a speech about unity and tradition, peppered with lines that felt lifted from every Hallmark card ever made. When she finished, the crowd applauded. Velda stood, dabbing her eye like it was a scene from a soap opera. Grace curtsied. Someone handed her flowers. I stood alone in the wings, note cards crumpling in my hands. No one explained the switch. No one even looked my way. After the event, I slipped outside into the parking lot before the lights came back on. As I stood by the car, an older woman, one of Velda's cousins maybe, approached me. "Back in our day," she said with a tight smile, "we knew when to step aside. You know, give the stage to the real daughters." I forced a smile. "Is that so?" "Family's not just about marriage certificates, sweetheart. It's about roots." I didn't reply, just nodded once and turned away. Inside the car, Silas fastened his seatbelt. "Don't make this a thing." "A thing?" I asked, voice calm. "They were trying to honor Grace. It wasn't about you." I turned to face him, slowly. "It's never about me, Silas. That's the problem." He stared straight ahead, fingers tightening on the steering wheel. We drove home in silence, the kind that screams inside your skull. Later that night, I took out the note cards I'd meant to read. I sat at the kitchen table and went through each line, not aloud, just quietly in my head. I wasn't sad, not exactly. I was sharpening, refining. What they took tonight wasn't my voice. It was just a microphone. The speech I'd prepared wasn't for them anyway. "This is not what I married into," I whispered. Then I opened my laptop, created a new folder, and labeled it Plan B. They wanted to cut me from the stage. What they didn't know, I was learning how to build my own. The next Thursday, I pulled into the driveway after a long meeting with a client who couldn't decide between quartz and marble. My back ached, and all I wanted was to change into pajamas, pour a glass of wine, and pretend I didn't live in a house where alliances were formed like war councils. I stepped inside and set my purse on the hallway bench. The house was unusually quiet. No news playing in the background, no clinking from the kitchen. The air felt still, staged. Upstairs, I pushed open the bedroom door and stopped cold. There, spread across my side of the closet, were designer dresses I didn't own, and bags with initials that weren't mine. Shoes still in their dust covers lined the floor like soldiers in formation. And in the middle of it all, a monogrammed suitcase with the initials GR. I stood there for a beat, letting it register. Then I walked back down and called Silas. He answered on the second ring. "Hey," he said. Casual like this wasn't about to flip everything on its head. "Grace is here?" "Yeah," he said. "Mom's house is being treated for mold or something. It's temporary." "Why is her stuff in our bedroom?" "She said she didn't want to take over the guest room. Figured it was easier to share your closet." I waited. "She didn't ask," I said, more to myself than him. "She said you two could make it work. It's just a few days." She needed a place to stay, not to play dress up with my life. He didn't respond, and I didn't give him the chance. I hung up and walked back upstairs. I didn't scream. I didn't touch her things. I simply grabbed one of the garment bags and placed it carefully in a box. I was folding another dress when she walked in, wearing leggings and sipping from one of my mugs. "Oh, don't worry," she said brightly. "I left you the left side." I turned, met her gaze. "I wasn't worried," I said evenly. "I was wondering who gave you the key to my boundaries." She blinked, then laughed like I'd made a joke. "Silas said it'd be fine." She shrugged. "Velda, too. It's just for a little while." I nodded once, then returned to folding. She stayed a moment longer, watching me, waiting for something. Approval, permission, maybe a fight. She got none. That night, after brushing my teeth and making sure every door in the house was locked, I went to my office to jot down a few notes for a project. When I opened my planner, something fell out. It was a folded piece of stationery, cream-colored, thick, expensive. Inside, in that looping cursive I'd seen on birthday cards and holiday invites, it read, "Some people don't fit, no matter how long they try. Stop embarrassing yourself. A Granger." I sat there, staring at the ink, letting the weight of those words settle. She didn't even sign her name. She didn't have to. I didn't cry. I didn't storm into anyone's room or demand explanations. Instead, I pulled out my phone, took a picture of the note, and labeled it Evidence 01. Then I slid it into a file labeled Severance Plan, the same folder where the photos of the album lived, along with a copy of our mortgage agreement and a saved draft of a new lease in my name. When someone breaks into your house, you call the cops. But when someone breaks into your role, your space in a family, your very name, there's no hotline for that. So, you learn to defend yourself differently. They could play house all they wanted. I was done pretending I still lived there. If they were building their exit strategy for me, they should have known. I was already sketching theirs. By Sunday morning, I'd already decided to go. Not because I believed anything would change, but because I needed to see how far they'd go when they thought I was still playing along. Velda's voice had been syrupy on the phone. "I'd really love for you to come to brunch," she'd said. "Just a little something with the family. Let's clear the air, shall we?" Silas called it a reset. I called it reconnaissance. I wore navy, simple and pressed, with pearl earrings Velda once gifted me, back when she was still pretending I was one of them. I brought a bottle of wine and a pie from the market, both untouched. Symbolic. The house was buzzing when we arrived. Laughter spilled from the back patio. Grace's voice floated above the rest. High, polished, rehearsed. I followed Silas through the sliding doors like a guest in my own in-law's life. Everyone was already seated. I took the only open chair, farthest from Velda, and with the worst view of the yard. Velda stood, glass in hand, tapping it lightly with her ring finger. The chatter died down. "I just want to take a moment," she began, smiling wide, "to honor someone who's brought grace, loyalty, and warmth into this family, not just recently, but for years now." She turned slightly toward Grace, who dipped her chin in mock modesty. "To Grace, who's been like a daughter in this family since forever. Some people are born into this circle, others—" She paused, her smile tightening. "Well, they borrow it." Laughter erupted, light and careless, as if that was just a cute remark, as if it hadn't been a direct hit. I set down my fork with a soft clink. A cousin across the table shot me a quick, apologetic glance. Someone muttered, "That was harsh." But no one said anything louder than their chewing. I didn't react. Not then, not there. After dessert, people began drifting indoors for coffee. I stayed behind, pretending to scroll through my phone while watching Velda fuss with the empty glasses. Grace came out a few minutes later, carrying a photo album I hadn't seen before. She slid into the chair beside me, flipping through it with practiced fingers. "Look at this one," she said, pointing to a picture of Silas in college. "That was the summer he came to visit my family in Cape Cod." I nodded, offering nothing. She tilted the album toward me again. "You know, he and I had a moment back then. Nothing serious. Life took us different ways. Still, funny how paths cross again, right?" I turned to her, held her gaze. "Funny is one word for it." She smiled, closed the album, and left it on the table. Inside, I found Silas refilling his coffee. "Did you know your mom was going to toast Grace like that?" I asked. He didn't look at me. "It was a compliment. To her." He sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. "It wasn't about you, Teresa. Don't make it about you." I didn't reply. I just watched him sip his coffee, like he wasn't erasing me one silence at a time. On the drive home, I stared out the window. My reflection flickered across the glass, half formed in the afternoon sun. I wasn't angry, not anymore. I was calculating. They mistook quiet for weak. They mistook my seat at their table as a privilege. But I was never theirs to approve. Back at the house, while Silas changed and the Sunday news played in the background, I went into my office. I printed a photo of Grace's clothes in my closet, tucked the brunch program into a folder, saved an audio file of Velda's toast from a recording I'd made on my phone. Then I pulled out a yellow legal pad and wrote across the top, "Exit on my terms." They didn't know it yet, but I was no longer in the room. I was already outside, holding the match. Friday morning, 5 days after that brunch, I woke up with one goal: find the truth on paper. Silas had left early, probably to avoid having to answer questions he could no longer dodge with a kiss on the forehead or a pot of coffee. I took advantage of the silence, poured myself half a mug of yesterday's leftover brew, and headed into our home office. The file cabinet was a mess. Nothing labeled, folders stuffed half shut, receipts from 3 tax seasons ago crammed behind vacation brochures. But tucked behind a stack of utility bills, I spotted a small key taped to the back of the bookshelf. The kind of key you wouldn't think twice about, unless you were married to a man who had a habit of misplacing only the things he didn't want found. I tried it on the bottom drawer of his desk. It clicked. Inside was a slim manila envelope labeled Property, Marlowe Granger, in Velda's handwriting. I pulled it out, opened it, and saw the familiar outline of our deed. Except something was off. There was an amendment dated just 3 weeks earlier, showing a 25% ownership transfer to Velda Moreau. My signature was on it. Only it wasn't mine. I stared at the signature long enough to memorize every curve and flourish someone else had tried to mimic. The T was too round. The R leaned too far left. Whoever faked it didn't know I looped my E like a backwards comma. I didn't scream. I didn't tear anything. I took photos, every page, front and back. I emailed them to myself. I uploaded copies to a secure cloud account I'd created 2 days ago. Then I resealed the envelope, locked the drawer, and put the key back behind the shelf. At noon, I drove to the bank. I told the woman at the desk I was exploring refinancing options and wanted to check on our accounts. She smiled warmly, pulled up our file, then paused. There's a note here that certain transactions have been restricted. Would you mind waiting a moment?" She disappeared for 10 minutes. When she returned, she was accompanied by a manager, a man with a clipboard, and a face trained to look apologetic without admitting fault. "Mrs. Marlowe," he said gently, "there's been a request recently, submitted by Mr. Granger, to begin transferring the balance of your joint savings into an individual trust account, under the name Granger Legacy Holding." I stared at him. And when exactly was this request made? Last Monday, he replied. The paperwork still pending final signatures? I nodded, folded my hands. And my name? Not included? Right. He shifted, unsure how to proceed. Would you like to halt the process? He asked. No, I said. I'd like copies of everything, and I'd like to be informed immediately if anything else changes. He hesitated, then nodded. Back home, I closed all the blinds before sitting down at my desk. In my private folder, I saved the scans of the deed under the name forgery check affidavit.pdf. Then I uploaded the account records, labeled Trust Withdrawal, Notice PNG. I stared at the screen. This wasn't just poor communication. This wasn't confusion or misaligned priorities. This was calculated. He was trying to erase me, in numbers, in contracts, in the paper trail that people trust more than faces or vows. But I understood now. They weren't building a legacy. They were digging a grave, just not for themselves. The only legacy I needed was the one I'd write for myself, on record, in ink, and in court if I had to. This wasn't just betrayal. It was theft, and I was going to treat it exactly as the law would. I didn't sleep much the night I discovered the deed transfer. By morning, my body ached from tension I hadn't let release. I moved on autopilot, fed the cat, drank cold coffee straight from the pot, and opened my laptop to organize the files I'd saved the day before. Every document had its place. Every folder had a purpose. But when I tried to make a routine wire transfer to one of my vendors, a red banner flashed across the screen. Account access restricted. Please contact your primary account holder. At first, I thought it was a glitch. I tried again. Same message. I refreshed the browser, logged out, logged back in. Still nothing. I called Silas. No answer. I called the bank. Let me pull up your file, the woman on the other end said, in that polished, overly pleasant tone banks train into people. There was a pause. Mrs. Marlowe, it looks like your user access was temporarily removed last night due to a request from the primary account holder. Temporarily removed? Yes, just until some internal account restructuring is finalized. I felt the breath catch in my throat, but didn't let it surface. Can I get a copy of the restructuring documents? I asked calmly. Of course. I can email them to the address we have on file. That won't be necessary, I said. I'll come in and pick them up. 20 minutes later, I was sitting in a leather chair at the bank while a junior officer nervously tapped a pen against his clipboard. Technically, he said, because Mr. Granger is the original account initiator and you're listed as a joint user, he has the right to request temporary lockdown during a transition. Transition to what? I asked, though I already knew. He glanced at the screen, then leaned in slightly. There's a note that funds are being moved into a new trust. The name of the account is Granger Legacy Holding. Of course it was. And my name? He blinked. It's not listed on the beneficiary tier. I thanked him, stood up, and walked out without waiting for him to offer me a mint. Back home, I opened the bank packet and scanned every page. I highlighted lines. I bookmarked statutes. Then I printed the login lock notice and filed it under financial tampering. The next day, I remembered I had my annual OB/GYN appointment coming up, so I called to confirm the date. Actually, the receptionist said after a brief pause, it looks like your insurance policy was terminated last week. Terminated? Yes, we were notified your coverage ended as of the 1st of the month. Do you have a secondary provider you'd like to list? I didn't answer right away. My mind was already racing. No, I said, but I will. I always do. After the call, I sat down on the edge of the couch. My hands were steady, but my chest buzzed with a low hum that felt like voltage. It wasn't just that he'd started separating assets. He was severing protection, quietly removing the scaffolding that held my everyday life together. Money, health, credibility. Velda's fingerprints were all over it, even if she wasn't the one typing the emails or signing the forms. I knew how she worked. She didn't swing the axe. She just handed it to someone and told them where to aim. That evening, while making a second cup of tea, I turned on the television and caught the tail end of a local segment, Profiles in Philanthropy. And there she was, Velda Moreau, sitting center frame in a pastel blazer, talking about legacy and lifting up women in our community. She smiled wide, tilted her chin just so. A picture of compassion, of civic grace. I stood in front of the screen, tea cooling in my hand, and whispered, "You can play respectable for the cameras, but off camera, I've already started building your indictment." Later, I saved a new document to my legal file, insurancedropnotice.pdf. I renamed the folder from Evidence to Prosecution Prep. I was done collecting receipts. It was time to send the bill. By the time Sunday arrived, I wasn't surprised. Velda had sent a group text earlier that week, dressed in the usual faux humility. "Family dinner this Sunday, let's clear the air. Bring your appetite and your forgiveness." Silas had read it aloud while pouring his morning coffee, like she was extending an olive branch. I knew better. They weren't setting the table for reconciliation. They were staging a ceremony, and I was the featured offering. But I went anyway. Because sometimes you need to see the end of something up close to know how it has to burn. The house smelled of roasted garlic and something overly sweet, like she'd poured an extra cup of sugar into every dish for effect. The dining room sparkled under soft yellow light. China that hadn't seen daylight in years gleamed on the table. Grace stood near the sideboard, arranging silverware like she'd lived there forever. I walked in with a bottle of wine, placed it down wordlessly, and took my seat. They hadn't assigned places, but it was clear where they expected me. At the edge, farthest from Velda. Dinner began civil. Velda passed dishes with a smile tight enough to snap. Small talk pinged around the table like tennis balls no one wanted to chase. Grace recounted a charity event. Velda corrected someone's pronunciation of an herb. Silas said almost nothing, and I waited. It came as we were clearing salad plates. Velda tilted her head toward me, then looked around the table with a performer's pause. "You know," she said lightly, "when I think of legacy, I think of how a house becomes a home. Of how women shape families, not just with effort, but with grace. Real grace." Someone chuckled. Grace beamed. I set my fork down, wiped the corner of my mouth, and met Velda's eyes. If legacy means erasing a woman from her own home, then yes, you've built one. Silence, the kind that sucks air from a room, followed. Velda blinked. "Well, that was unnecessary." I didn't flinch. "So was my signature on a forged deed." Her mouth twitched. Grace stood suddenly. "Let me check the roast," she said, vanishing into the kitchen like smoke. But Velda followed. Moments passed. Then something clattered. Someone shouted. I rose, instinct pulling me toward the noise. As I rounded the corner into the kitchen, Grace backed away from the stove, hands up, eyes wide. Velda stood near the range, clutching a cast-iron pan, oil still shimmering inside. "You're the one who keeps making it a war," she snapped. "You think you can humiliate me in front of my family?" I didn't move. She stepped forward, and in a motion so quick I only registered it in heat, she threw the pan's contents across the room. The oil arced like liquid fire. I turned, too slow. Pain lit up my shoulder and arm like lightning. The sound of crashing plates rang behind me, followed by screams. Grace's, I think. Chairs scraped, someone ran. But Silas didn't move. I stumbled back, grasping the counter, chest heaving, eyes wide. The heat seared, but it was the silence that carved deeper. My voice held steady. "You just crossed from cruel to criminal." Still, he said nothing. I staggered into the hallway, every step dragging pain along my side. A blur of shadows surrounded me, faces I didn't bother to name. I looked up at the corner of the kitchen doorway. The small, nearly forgotten security camera blinked red. Still on. Still recording. Installed during a remodel months ago. Velda had insisted on it for safety. I'd insisted it stay when she wanted it taken down. My breathing steadied. My spine straightened. They hadn't just burned my skin. They'd branded their own guilt into video. The next morning, bandaged and sore, I sat at my desk with a glass of water and a controlled calm. I opened the security app, found the footage, and watched the scene unfold frame by frame. There it was. Her hand. Her rage. My evidence. I downloaded the file. Named it Exhibit A. They thought they'd scar me into silence, but all they did was make the truth visible. The ride to the ER blurred past me like streetlights smeared across wet glass. I remember the silence most. Silas gripping the steering wheel, jaw clenched, eyes straight ahead. Like if he didn't speak, it wouldn't be real. My skin pulsed with fire, the pain blooming in waves that came with every bump in the road. But I didn't cry. I wasn't even angry. I was already beyond that. Inside, the fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, while a nurse named Maggie gently guided me into an exam room. She was steady and soft-spoken, the kind of woman who'd seen everything but still offered kindness like it mattered. She unwrapped the towel from my shoulder, and I saw her eyes flinch. She didn't say it, but the look told me. Second degree at the very least. "Can you tell me what happened?" she asked as she applied the cool gel. I looked down at the floor. "A family dinner," I said. "She threw hot oil at me." "She?" "My mother-in-law." Maggie didn't blink. She just nodded and kept working. "That's not family, that's assault." Silas sat in the corner, silent as ever. When the attending came in, he spoke before I could. "She wasn't herself tonight," he muttered. "She's been under a lot of stress." I turned my head toward him slowly. "You think stress excuses attempted disfigurement?" He didn't answer. Just looked down at his shoes like they had something to say. The doctor took notes, checked my vitals, and finally handed me a clipboard with a form. "This is for the incident report," he said. "We're required to file it, but you can choose whether or not to pursue it formally." Maggie's hand gently brushed mine as she placed a pen beside the form. I signed. Not because I needed revenge, because I was done playing the forgiving daughter-in-law in a story written by someone else. As the hours dragged on, and the pain settled into a dull roar, the detective arrived. A tall man in a plain shirt, no nonsense. "Mrs. Marlowe," he said, "do you want to press charges?" I nodded. "Yes." He opened his notebook. "And is there anything else you'd like to add?" "Yes," I said again. "I want to file for legal separation." I saw Silas flinch in the corner of my eye. That was the only response I got from him that night. By the time we returned home, dawn was pressing through the curtains. I moved slowly, carefully, every step calculated around the ache. I didn't wait for Silas to ask how I was feeling. I didn't expect him to. While he went upstairs to get some rest, I opened the filing cabinet and pulled out a folder labeled Receipts, Taxes. Not because I was looking for anything. I just needed to occupy my mind. Inside, I found something I didn't remember putting there. A small black USB drive wedged between two old W-2s. I stared at it for a second, then plugged it into my laptop. An audio file opened. I hit play. Silas's voice filled the room. "Once she's gone, we put the house in your name. She'll calm down eventually." Velda's reply came next, crisp and cold. "We just have to push her far enough to make it look mutual." I didn't stop the recording. I let it play to the end. I sat back, let out a long breath, and stared at the ceiling. No screaming, no fury, just a kind of confirmation that comes when the final puzzle piece falls into place and you realize the picture was always meant to betray you. I closed the laptop. "Mutual's off the table," I whispered. By noon, I was packing a small duffel bag with clothes, my documents, a copy of the police report, and a flash drive now labeled Leverage. I stood in front of the mirror in the hallway, bandaged, exhausted, but upright. "This is the day I stop surviving in their story," I told my reflection, "and start living in mine." Before I walked out the door, I left my house keys on the counter, but I kept the truth in my pocket. 2 weeks after I walked out of that house, I walked into a courtroom. It was colder than I expected, not from temperature, but from what filled the space. Control, reputation, the weight of decorum, everything Velda had built her life around. And for the first time, she was the one being called to account. I sat in the front row, long sleeves covering my healing arm. I didn't look around for Silas. I didn't need to. I could feel the discomfort rolling off him across the aisle like a draft under a door. The clerk called the case. Commonwealth of Massachusetts versus Velda Moreau. My full name echoed behind it. Not as a daughter-in-law, not as a wife, as a complainant. Velda didn't look at me. She wore navy, hair-pinned, pearls fastened like armor. Her mouth never moved except to whisper to her attorney, a man who looked like he'd been paid handsomely to sanitize the ugliness. Michael Steiner, my lawyer, stood tall, calm, methodical. His voice filled the space with reason that was impossible to ignore. This case isn't about a kitchen accident, it's about erasure, about power used like a blade, masked behind family tradition, about a woman being burned not just in body, but in identity. The judge listened, face unreadable. The jury took notes. Silas shifted in his seat, eyes flicking anywhere but mine. When it was my turn to testify, I walked slowly, steadily, and swore in with a voice I barely recognized, because it had weight now. Michael began gently. He let me speak in my words. I described the dinner, the long arc of oil across the room, the pain, the silence. Then he held up a document. "Do you recognize this?" I nodded. "It's the forged deed." "And this?" He displayed the original, notarized, filed years ago. My name alone. Gasps murmured across the room. "That house wasn't a gift," I said, eyes locking on Velda. "It was mine, and they tried to take it with lies." Michael returned to the table, but didn't sit. "Your Honor," he said, "we have one more witness, someone who reached out after learning of this case, someone who saw what happened behind closed doors." A shuffle of movement at the back of the room. I turned as Gloria stepped forward. She looked older than I remembered. Smaller, somehow, but her voice? Clear. "I worked for the Grangers for 6 years," she said. "I cleaned, I cooked, and I heard everything." She looked straight at Velda. "I heard them planning, Ms. Moreau and Mr. Granger. They said, let her think she's safe until it's all signed. They laughed about it. Said it would be easier if Teresa walked away angry, make her look unstable." I didn't breathe. Velda blinked fast, one hand trembling in her lap. Silas closed his eyes. Gloria continued, calm as a preacher reading scripture. "They thought I was invisible, but I saw everything." She stepped down without fanfare. I exhaled, maybe for the first time in weeks. The rest was process. Closing arguments, court recess. But it didn't matter, because I'd already won the moment truth took center stage and didn't flinch. Velda was escorted out quietly by 2 bailiffs. No cuffs. Just a slow, stiff walk through a room that no longer applauded her. Silas stayed behind, pretending to gather papers. He never looked my way. I didn't offer him the grace of a goodbye. Outside, the air felt thick. Reporters hovered, but Michael shielded me, ushering me through the crowd. That night, I sat alone in a hotel room and wrote a sentence in my notebook. Some people think justice is loud, but sometimes it's the silence after the truth lands that echoes the longest. They thought the courtroom was the end, but I wasn't done reclaiming what was mine. A week after the verdict, I unpacked a small set of plates in my new apartment. It wasn't much, just a 1-bedroom unit with beige walls and carpet that looked like it had seen better tenants. But it was quiet, clean, mine. No echo of high heels clicking down the hallway that weren't mine. No smell of someone else's perfume in my linens. Just stillness. I took the last plate from the box and placed it gently in the cabinet. Then I noticed the envelope on the counter. Thick cream cardstock tucked into a manila sleeve. My name typed in bold. Michael had sent it over. Silas's counsel has requested a private negotiation, the cover note read. Enclosed is a copy of their proposed settlement. I stood for a moment, fingers grazing the seal. Then I opened it. A stack of legal pages, clipped neatly, spelled out the offer. I would receive 30% of the proceeds from the sale of our home, but only if I agreed to drop all remaining charges, including civil claims, and sign a binding non-disclosure agreement. Folded in the back was a yellow sticky note in Silas's handwriting. Let's not destroy each other. We both made mistakes. I sat down slowly, the papers resting in my lap. I read them twice. The tone, the implication, the arrogance soaked into every clause. No, Silas, I didn't make a mistake. I made a choice. The next morning, I met Michael at his office downtown. His desk was clutter-free, his tone casual as always, but I saw the twitch in his brow when he skimmed the offer. They're trying to get ahead of a storm, he said, closing the folder. Want me to shred it, or should we respond with fire? I smiled for the first time that day. Tell them no, and tell them this. My silence isn't for sale. Michael tapped his pen twice. Then let's make your truth worth hearing. We spent the next hour drafting the foundation for a civil suit, financial conspiracy, asset concealment, spousal fraud. His assistant handed me coffee, and we reviewed statements, evidence, the works. It wasn't about money anymore. It was about saying out loud, through legal code and documentation, what had been whispered or ignored for years. After the meeting, I walked home instead of taking a cab. The spring air was cool against my skin. For the first time, I noticed the world again. Not through the lens of defense or survival, but just as it was. A bird nesting above a traffic light. A woman laughing too loud into her phone. The smell of fresh mulch in front of a grocery store. When I returned to my apartment, I swept the entryway floor. Not because it was dirty, but because it was mine. Each grain of dust that left my space was something I chose to remove. I leaned the broom against the wall, looked around the small room with its hand-me-down furniture, and exhaled. People think freedom is loud, announcements, declarations, confetti. But sometimes it's this quiet, this clean, just hearing your own thoughts in a room no one else claims. I didn't need to win everything. I just needed to walk away without owing them my silence. The morning sun cast wide golden stripes across the library floor as I stood just behind the curtain, waiting to walk out. 1 year to the day, same date, different woman. Maggie, now my closest friend and co-founder of the event, gave my hand a light squeeze before disappearing into the audience. A sea of people, survivors, advocates, neighbors, strangers who had once whispered the word domestic like it was contagious, filled the rotunda. Above them hung a long banner with block letters that read, Courage Day for the voices they tried to silence. The MC announced my name, and I stepped into the light. There was no trembling. I walked to the podium and opened my folder to the speech I'd written the night before. But before I read it, I reached into the pocket of my blazer and pulled out a printed email. The paper had been folded and refolded too many times. I unfolded it slowly. I want to begin today, I said, with a quote from someone who once promised to love me. A hush settled. I read, steady and unflinching. She's not valuable anymore. Some people in the crowd shifted, others held still. I looked up. Funny thing about value, I said. You don't lose it when others stop seeing it. You lose it when you start believing them. And I don't. From there, I spoke of choices, of healing, of the long, quiet climb back to owning your name again. Not the kind that's embroidered or printed on wedding programs, but the name you say out loud in the mirror when no one's listening. The one you keep even when someone tries to erase you from rooms, from records, from memory. When I stepped down, Maggie took the stage. She shared her story. Then others followed. Burn survivors. Women who left quietly in the middle of the night. One man who said he'd never told anyone before. We cut the ribbon on the new legal aid desk, the Marlowe table. built with community funds and volunteer hours, a place where anyone could come and ask, "Where do I start?" People clapped, some cried, but it wasn't a sad room. It was filled with air that had been held for too long, finally being exhaled. Later that evening, I walked home through Back Bay, past shops closing up, dogs pulling leashes, couples arguing softly over dinner reservations. I turned onto the block where I used to live. I didn't stop. The house stood there like a relic, well kept on the outside, hollow underneath. Velda was now serving a reduced sentence under house arrest. Her public image, once spotless, had fractured. Her social invitations dwindled. Her speaking engagements vanished. Silas lost his job. His appeal was denied. The firm cited ethical concerns. Public record did the rest. But I didn't need revenge. The truth did what it needed to do. I passed the gate, the one he once painted navy to match my planters. They were gone now. So was the wreath I made from fall leaves our first year there. My feet kept moving. At my new place, I climbed the stairs 2 at a time. Inside, I turned on the kettle, slipped off my shoes, and stood by the window watching dusk fall over the city. Every year on this date, I remember not what they did, but what I chose. And I choose me. Every time.